All right, so we have a few minutes left, and again, folks, feel free to throw something in the chat. But I'll name a personal bias I have about God. So I've always been persuaded that God is bigger than gender, that God transcends gender. And if we believe that, there's the perspective that follows, which is that both God and creation are expansive in so many ways, sexuality and gender being among them. So, what would you think? And I'm guessing maybe this is too basic of a question, but I'm curious, what do you think about ministering from that understanding and what that means for LGBTQ youth who've always heard of God as He? What does it mean to really kind of expand that and do away with that or break it up? Or, yeah.
I honestly, it's one of when we do that, we expand people's minds and hearts and worldview in such a particular way. And you people asked about like one of those stories before, like Moses in the burning bush, and the fact that God doesn't say God's name because that is too containing and too under our like human structures and authority. And when Moses said, "Who sent me?" and God's answer, is this: "I am who I am. I will be who I will." Again, the Hebrew people know this better than I do. God can't stay in one tense when describing God's own self. And so the idea of like, well, God has to be male. And what does that mean to be male? Does that mean having a penis? Does that mean God has testosterone? Does that mean, these kind of things? And realizing like, well, God's already beyond all of that. And I will say too, the other one that always sort of intrigues me is, if we're from churches that do Trinitarian theology, the Trinity is super queer, right? How are we believing? Like, again, if people can think like, if people get really hung up on there can't be more than two genders, but then we talk about a God, one God who is three different figures that are all the same thing, but all very distinct from one another. And in this weird intertwined thruple relationship with God's own self, that is, it's big, it's huge, it's confusing, and queer becomes a very good word to describe it, because we do a lot of stuff to try to contain it, to try to understand it, to diagram it, to do this. We have people preach sermons on it one Sunday a year, trying to explain it to people. And yet for someone who, again, someone seeing themselves as like, I don't feel like I fit into these categories that exist. Well, guess what? You can relate to God because God doesn't exist. It doesn't fit within these categories that we exist. And then for other people, we go back and we revisit those stories over and over and over again. That helps people to think about, get that same reaction that Danny does during our podcast of like, why has no one ever talked about this before? Are we fitting scripture into the way that we understand the world, or are we letting the stories that we have written down and told about God actually like blow our world up in a really big and expansive way? And we can do that through God's creation. We can do that through I am who I am. We can do that through the theology of the Trinity, which is super confusing, and yet at the same time can be like super comforting when we don't feel like we fit into those the categories that exist for us too. And that's, I'm saying this, that's not just good for youth. It's not just good for LGBTQ people. That's good for all of us to hear. And so there is this expansiveness of like, this is not just ministry for youth, that's queer youth that's silent off by themselves. It actually helps all of us feel like we're building a better relationship with God, the creator, God, the redeemer, God, the sanctifier.
Yeah, we recently had Mark Yaconelli come and do an in-person presentation on storytelling. And so much of it is about how youth find themselves in the story and how we as adults and youth workers find ourselves in the story. So being able to find ourselves in the identity of God in a way that feels very welcoming and joyful, that can only be affirming, that can only be lightening and provide a sense of belonging for these young people. So, yeah.
Yeah.